We're looking today at another element of corporate worship, a very important one, which is music. Congregational song, particularly, is a very important part of what we do in congregational worship. Of course, you can know from the Psalms, verse 1 and 2 of Psalm 95, the psalmist writes, "Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song." So we know that the Bible encourages us to sing our praise, to sing our worship to the Lord. You know as well as I do that during the last few decades, music has become quite a lightning rod in the church. And instead of serving to unify the church body, it has served to divide many congregations because of the issues of style. But let's look today at the purpose of congregational song and worship. Why do we sing? Primarily, song allows the church to express her faith, to tell the story, the whole story of who God is and what he has done. You know, Martin Luther is quoted as saying, "Let God speak directly to his people through the scriptures, and let his people respond with grateful songs of praise." You know, Luther himself was a great hymn writer. The most famous of his contributions is "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," which is a paraphrase, really, of Psalm 46. But there are various functions of song that we can use in corporate worship gathering. One of the primary ways that we see this is allowing us to voice our praise to God. Praise being thanking God for who he is, admiring, appreciating who God is, the quality of his character, and also for his mighty works that he has done on behalf of his people, redemption being the most foremost of those that we think about. So praise is a very important function. Song allows us to do that in congregational worship. Prayer, lifting our prayers to the Lord. Some of our songs that we sing are literally prayers to God. And then others can be songs of testimony, which express what God has done in our lives personally. Other songs allow us to confess to the Lord and even lament to the Lord. And then finally, songs allow us to proclaim the gospel. And many songs do this. They present the gospel through the words of the songs. So what kind of songs do we sing in corporate worship? The New Testament, Paul wrote Colossians 3:16, speaking of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs as three types of songs that were common in that day in Christian worship. Psalms being those odes, kind of like the book of Psalms in the Old Testament. And then there were the more metered hymns. And in the New Testament, we have examples of that, such as in Philippians 2, hymns to Christ, which were more structured and more in stanza form. And then spiritual songs. Those were songs that were unrehearsed, unknown perhaps before the gathering. They were spontaneous expressions of song for what God was doing in a person's life. So the psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs as three types of genres that Paul writes about. But you know, we have many genres today in our cultural context. Here in the United States, for example, we have traditional hymns. I have here the Baptist hymnal. It's got a lot of examples of traditional hymns, such as Great is Thy Faithfulness, How Great Thou Art, All Creatures of Our God and King, um, A Mighty Fortress is an example of that. There are many traditional hymns represented here. There are also gospel songs is another genre, and gospel songs being those that are basically testimony type songs. Blessed Assurance, Jesus is Mine is an example. Fanny Crosby gospel songs. We have praise choruses, many examples of that. Change my heart, O God. Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary. From the 70s and 80s, we particularly had a great movement of praise choruses that even went into the 90s and even to the new millennium. So there are a lot of praise choruses that the churches have used. And then modern worship songs. Perhaps one of the more famous is by Keith Getty and Stuart Townend. In Christ Alone would be a modern worship song. Many others. Cornerstone, example. Some of Hillsong's songs again are modern worship songs. So you can see that we have a great variety in the genres of songs. But if you think about worship beyond the borders of the United States, you think about worship worldwide, Christian worship, you're going to find even many more genres than that are out there. So they're expressive of the context, the musical context of the particular people that are singing. So how do we choose the songs for corporate worship? Well, we need to first understand that when we are choosing songs for corporate worship, that we're literally putting songs or putting words in people's mouths. We're actually giving the congregation the words that we want them to sing, and they actually do sing those. And we have to understand that there's quite an educational process going on there, a formative process. People not only sing those songs in the worship service, but they go home singing them. They're listening to those words over and over, and those words then take root in their minds and in their hearts. So we want to make sure that that we are choosing good songs for corporate worship. So what's the challenge on that? The big challenge is, how do we go about that? You know, for worship planners in some decades ago, they used the hymnal. And one of the strong things about the hymnal was that the songs in it had already been vetted. They had already gone through the process of committees of people looking at the theological content of these. And in fact, I'm looking here at the newest Baptist hymnal, which was released in 2008. And there were several committees put together, a theological committee that looked at every song that was presented as a candidate to be included in this hymnal. And they vetted those words, those lyrics, to make sure that they were strong, that they were biblically sound. And so this was a kind of a closed canon. When people would use the hymnal, they at least knew that it had been through that process. But for worship planners today, one of the challenges is that we have many resources to choose from. We have the internet. We have websites, praise charts, hymn charts, and Song Select and CCLI, and all of these resources of places where we can go and find worship music. And those things perhaps have been, but perhaps have not been vetted. And so it falls upon the worship planner, the pastor, the pastoral team to look at those words and those songs to determine whether or not that is something the congregation should be singing. So that's one of the challenges that we have today, what we call an open canon versus a closed canon of a hymnal. Some of the popular approaches to choosing songs for corporate worship, unfortunately, are things like they choose popular songs. If it's on the radio, then we want to sing it. If it has a catchy tune that people can remember real quickly, they like it. And if they like the sound of the music, then yes, we should include that. Well, those are perhaps not the best way to choose songs. Some better possibilities would be to look at how the song helps to tell the story of the gospel, how that song helps people to give voice to their praise, and with a very strong spiritual foundation is another thing that's very important. Now, there's some criteria that I think that we can apply here, and so let me give you a list of about 6 different criteria. One is a theological criteria. Obviously, we want to pass this song through the grid of theology to see if it is a sound theological, and if not, then let's put it aside. Sometimes a song can be really great, but there's 2 or 3 lines perhaps in it that are very questionable theologically. And sometimes worship planners go ahead and overlook that, and they say, oh, it's just 1 or 2 words. In fact, sometimes worship planners will say, I'm going to just change those words. But be very careful with that, because copyright law really does not allow you to do that. You do not have a license to just take a copyrighted song and rewrite some of the words for it. Now, you can get permission to do that. For example, Lifeway got permission to do that with a Hillsong, the song that they were singing of "Worthy is the Lamb," and at one place in the lyrics, it talks about the darling of heaven crucified. And in our culture, that doesn't communicate very well, the darling of heaven. And so they got permission from the copyright holders to change that to the treasure of heaven crucified in that song, Worthy is the Lamb. So it can be done, but you have to go through the right channels to do it, and we can't just change things even for our congregation to use. We don't have permission to do that. But so the first criteria is the theological filter and criteria to make sure that this song is good theology that we're having our people to sing. The second integrity criteria is lyrical, a lyrical integrity. And mostly what we're talking about here is that there is a coherence of thought, that people understand, it's understandable, that it's not open to a lot of interpretations. Also, that it would not be trite lyrics. We definitely want these lyrics to be fresh and imaginative. And in terms of this, N.T. Wright has said this in an interview that he gave to Worship Leader magazine back in 2012. He says, I worry when the words of some of the modern worship songs seem to me just a random selection of Christian slogans, as it were, rather than actually a narrative of the world as claimed by Jesus and as rescued by Jesus in his death and resurrection. Songs that recognize that the world is still a suffering place, but looking forward to the new creation. Some worship songs are struggling to say that, but if the narrative is broken, then it's not actually helping the people who are singing it in the way that it should. So we want to make sure that the lyrics of the songs have an integrity about them. Related to that is the musical integrity of the songs we sing. It should be a tuneful melody, interesting harmonies, lively rhythmic patterns, but perhaps the most important criteria about that would be that there is a good wedding of the musical ethos of the song with the lyrics. What are they trying to say? And what do I mean by that? That means that if the lyrics are pointing to a joyful hope in Christ, then the musical attitude or ethos ought to be one as well. We would not want to be singing a dirge when we're singing about the resurrection of Christ or something that's very joyful like that. On the other hand, we don't want to sing in a style that actually would sound flippant if we were the lyrics were speaking of the suffering of Christ and the cross of Christ. And there have actually been hymns, old hymns and other songs that have done that, maybe unintentionally. They've had a very lilting musical arrangement, but the text would be about the crucifixion of Christ. So we want to make sure that there's a good wedding of the ethos of the music with the lyrics of the song. Another integrity area is the worship service integrity. In other words, do the songs serve the functions of the worship service? Do they have a place for, do they serve as a prayer or praise or confession or lament or something that fits into the functions of the worship service? So we want to make sure that there's that aspect of it as well. And then, does the song have a pastoral integrity? Does it address, do the songs as a whole address all the aspects of a life devoted to Christ? That's really an issue of balance. And let me give you some other things to think about in terms of a balance of the songs that we're singing for corporate worship. One is a balance of vertical songs with horizontal songs. What do I mean by that? Vertical songs are songs that are addressed to God. We sing, I exalt thee, or I love you, Lord. Those are words that are addressed directly to God, and we call those a vertical type of lyric. And then words that are sung about God, but to one another. For example, to God be the glory, great things he has done. So loved he the world that he gave us his son. These are lyrics that are horizontal. We're singing them among ourselves to each other, but the words are about God. That is an example of horizontal lyrics. And so there needs to be a balance of that across the songs that we choose for worship. Also, a balance of praise, and even joyful praise with songs of lament. You know, the psalmist in the book of Psalms, they did this. There were songs that were high praise. There were songs that were just full of joy and joyful praise for who God is and what he has done. But then there were also songs that cried out to God. And so that's very much a part of this balance issue for the songs that we choose for worship. We're not really speaking of balance within one specific worship service, but we're speaking about over the context of several weeks of what the church would sing. And then the balance of the objective qualities when we sing songs that really focus on the objective qualities of God, and then balancing that with our subjective experience, which is what the gospel songs are really good at doing. So there should be some balance there. And how about the balance of the corporate dimension of worship with the personal dimension of worship? There could be a balance of songs that would be we as the church are singing this together. There's the pronouns would include we and us and our, compared with me and I and my. So there could be a balance of songs in terms of being corporate dimension versus the personal dimension. Some areas to be careful about in thinking about our worship music. It's possible, and I think it happens some, that we actually worship the worship and praise the praise. Let me read something to you that Harold Best has written about in his book, in Unceasing Worship. And he says the following. He says, whenever we assume that art or music mediates God's presence or causes him to be tangible, we have begun the trek into idol territory. You know, when we exalt our expressions of praise over God himself, or we put all of our emphasis on that, then we need to be careful that we're not falling into this worshiping the worship and praising the praise. So that's something to be careful about. Finally, I want to share a quote with you from John Wesley. And of course, John Wesley was in an 18th century founder of Methodism, but also a great preacher. And he and his brother Charles wrote many um, hymns that many of them are still sung today. Uh, but this is what he says about congregational singing. He says, above all, sing spiritually. Have an eye to God in every word you sing. Aim at pleasing God more than yourself or any other creature. In order to do this, attend strictly to the sense of what you sing, and see that your heart is not carried away with the sound, but offered to God continually. I hope that these thoughts on music and worship, and particularly congregational song in worship, can be helpful to you.